Welcome back to the Explainer. When we think about the endurance of the Roman Empire, specifically its eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, our minds usually go straight to shining armor, impenetrable walls, maybe epic cavalry charges. But today, we're taking a completely different lens. We're going to uncover the true, hidden machinery behind their incredible longevity. Let's get right into it. So I want to kick things off with a pretty direct question for you. How exactly do you forge an empire? Or maybe more accurately, how on earth do you keep one alive for centuries when you're literally surrounded by formidable enemies? We're talking the Sasanian Persians, the rapidly expanding Arab caliphates. It's so easy to assume it's all about battlefield bravery, right? The clash of swords, the flight of arrows. But here's the massive twist. It turns out empires aren't really kept alive by swords alone. They're actually maintained by, well, the medieval equivalent of spreadsheets and supply chains. The real unsung heroes of the Byzantine state, they were the meticulous bureaucrats, the administrators, the guys with the highly detailed ledgers who essentially turned the sheer chaos of war into this calculated logistical science. Our agenda today actually reads a bit like an ancient imperial dossier. First up, the bureaucracy of battle. Then, we'll cover the Byzantine war machine, followed by the ultimate military receipt. After that, sourcing the arsenal, and we'll wrap up with destination Isle of Crete.
All right, part one, the bureaucracy of battle.
Just take a second to really appreciate the sheer scale of the Byzantine world in the 10th and 11th centuries. Obviously, the seat of the empire is Constantinople, perfectly situated, incredibly defensible. But think about those borders stretching way out across modern-day Turkey and the Balkans. Imagine the absolute logistical nightmare of moving troops, armor, food, and weapons from the capital all the way out to those distant frontiers. And remember, we're talking way before modern engines or railways. The level of organization this required is just mind-blowing. And honestly, that organization is perfectly captured in a text called De Ceremonias, or the Book of Ceremonies. This is a 10th century compendium compiled by Emperor Constantine VII, and it is basically the ultimate historical blueprint. It wasn't just, a guide on how to run a fancy court banquet. It actually recorded the exact quantities and types of military equipment needed for massive naval expeditions. The state was micromanaging its operations to a degree that is frankly astonishing for the 900s. Which brings us to Section 2, the Byzantine war machine. Because, look, you can't just have ledgers. You need a system on the ground to actually execute these orders. By the 7th century, the Byzantines were facing some huge territorial losses, so they completely restructured their society. They created what were called the themata, or themes. Think of these as heavily militarized provinces. Instead of relying on one massive central field army that might take months to march out to a threat, they redeployed their forces to actually live in and defend specific regional borders.
But here's the real question. How on earth do they pay for it? Well, they instituted something called strateia. This was a mandatory hereditary military service. Essentially, the state tied your military service directly to land ownership. So if you held a specific plot of land, you were obligated to serve. And here's the real kicker, your local community or the revenue from that land had to pay for your military equipment. It was a pretty brilliant move by the state to shift that massive economic burden of arming provincial troops straight onto the rural economy.
So we end up with this fascinating dual structure in the Byzantine forces. On one side, you've got the themata. They're provincial, self-funded, and mostly defensive. But on the other side, you have the tagmata. These guys were the elite, centrally funded imperial guard regiments, like the famous Sholai, and they were garrisoned right near the capital. It's basically a widespread defensive net paired up with a highly trained state-funded strike force. All right, let's move to Section 3, the ultimate military receipt. So how exactly did the central government equip that strike force and manage the overarching logistics of a campaign? Well, the Byzantine state functioned surprisingly like a modern defense contractor. I mean, they had dedicated sub-departments. You had the Eidikon, which oversaw the acquisition of raw materials, stuff like iron, copper, and charcoal. Then there was the Armamenton, the production branch that physically manufactured the weapons. And finally, the Vestiarion, which acted as the public treasury for storage and coinage. The division of labor was just incredibly specialized. And the absolutely crucial point here is that none of this was abstract. Pulling straight from the De Ceremonias, specifically outlining the cargo for an actual expedition to Crete in 949 AD, they didn't just jot down "send weapons." Oh no, they recorded exactly 70 lamellar corselets, 100 swords, 10,000 arrows and 10,000 caltrops. By the way, if you don't know, caltrops are those nasty spiked iron weapons you throw on the ground to stop a cavalry charge. I like to think of this as the ultimate military receipt. It really grounds that abstract idea of a vast empire into the physical reality of thousands of individual, meticulously handcrafted items. Moving on to Section 4, Sourcing the Arsenal. Because, think about it for a second, where do 10,000 arrows and 10,000 iron caltrops actually come from? Think about the extreme elevation of the Taurus Mountains in Turkey. We all know mining iron ore and harvesting timber is incredibly heavy work. Now, picture trying to transport massive quantities of iron blooms and charcoal across those jagged, high-altitude mountain ranges in the 10th century. Honestly, the extreme geography made the logistics of simply getting the raw materials to the blacksmiths a Herculean task all on its own. I want you to just let this number sink in. 200,000. According to our primary sources, that was the exact quota of arrows the local commander, the Strategos of Thessalonico, was strictly ordered by the state to produce. And that was just for a single campaign. To actually hit those quotas, laborers had to execute this incredibly grueling three-stage process. First up, smelting raw iron ore into these spongy masses called blooms. Second, continuously harvesting immense amounts of timber, literally just to create the charcoal they needed to reach forging temperatures. And finally, the actual forging of the armaments in those provincial workshops. When you really stop to consider the sheer volume of labor hours required before a weapon ever touched the hands of a Byzantine soldier, it's absolutely staggering. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Destination, Isle of Crete. All of the sweat, iron, and ink ultimately culminated in massive strategic deployments. But, in the 10th century, you couldn't exactly just point a ship at a map and hit go. The Byzantine fleet had to meticulously calculate prevailing summer winds and sea currents. If the winds were against you, well, the expedition simply couldn't leave port. The logistics of nature were literally just as critical as the logistics of the armory. And this geographical reality completely dictated their strategy. The persistent northerly summer winds, they called them the Meltem, combined with specific Mediterranean currents, naturally pushed ships southward, right toward the highly strategic island of Crete. It was an absolutely essential stepping stone for controlling trade, protecting the Aegean Sea, and projecting power against the Arab fleets. Now, to tie this whole logistical loop together, we have some incredible archaeological evidence. The preserved YK-11 shipwreck, an actual Byzantine vessel discovered in the modern era, gives us this amazing, tangible look at the exact ships built to navigate these waters and carry the very supplies we've been talking about. But here is the ultimate historical irony, and I absolutely love this. When experts analyzed the wood from that shipwreck, it showed it was constructed primarily of Pinus brucia. That's a very specific type of pine tree native to, yep, you guessed it, Crete. The Byzantine supply chain was so unbelievably vast and integrated that they literally used timber harvested directly from the island of Crete just to build the warships meant to sail back and conquer it. No way, right? So, what's the big takeaway from this entire explainer? It's exactly this. Empires aren't forged solely on the battlefield. They are forged in the quiet ledgers of bureaucrats, the dark, grueling mines of the provinces, and the noisy, sawdust-filled shipyards. The Byzantine Empire managed to last for over 1,000 years, not just because of its fierce fighters, but because its administrative organization was, without a doubt, its true ultimate weapon. I want to leave you with this final thought. If a 10th century empire relied on such an intensely complex, hidden web of spreadsheets and supply chains just to survive, what invisible logistical machines are quietly, perfectly keeping our modern world running today without us even noticing? Maybe think about that the next time you see a delivery truck pass by, or a cargo ship out on the water, or honestly, even your own spreadsheet at work. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Stay curious, and I'll catch you next time.